Hey, what's going on, guys? This is AndrewChicken, and welcome back to another video. Making a build is one of the most important aspects of Deadlock, because buying the right items can mean the difference between a nice, easy victory and a staggering defeat. But making a build can be a daunting task, especially if you are newer to the game. So in this video, I'm going to give you some basic tips to help you improve your build crafting skills, and talk you through the general process that I go through when I make a build of my own. So tip number one is to have a distinct purpose for your build. Have a plan going in to augment one part of a character and turn it into a powerhouse, right? Make that your focal point of the build. And this will change drastically depending on the character that you're playing, because for some builds, you'll want to scale your gun damage, whereas with other builds, you'll want to scale spirit damage. But scaling spirit damage is different depending on whether you're playing someone who does DOT like Infernus or someone who does burst like Lash. Or you might want to play a support build. So try and figure out what type of build you want to be making before you even go into the build making process in the first place. So I'm going to be using Viscous as an example here because he has some of the most build diversity in the entire game. There are a lot of ways you can build him, and so I think it just works really well as an example. So we would first want to pick an ability that we want to augment, because that'll basically determine the playstyle that we're going to go for. So if we go for a splatter-based build, we're obviously going to be building around big spirit damage, big burst, and this also really combos well together with a goo ball-based build. They're kind of one and the same. So yeah, that would be our first archetype we could go for. Or if we want to build around the cube, then we'd be thinking to make a supportive and sort of tanky based build where we're prioritizing cube uptime, helping allies out, stuff like that. Or we could build around the puddle punch, in which case we'd be building for high mobility as well as big punch damage, which works very differently to how you would scale up ability damage like on the goo ball or the splatter. Or finally, we could just go for a gun based build, which I mean is probably the most boring way to play Viscous, but it is also an option. So once we've determined what the focus of our build is, now it's time to start throwing items together. Now, a very common format for builds will look something like this. You'll have an early game, a mid game, and a late game category, as well as a situational category for items that you might need sometimes but won't need other times. And I think this is generally a pretty good, easy way of making a build. You could fine tailor the build to your heart's content with all kinds of subcategories and stuff like that if you want, but this keeps things nice and simple, and I think for most players it's a pretty suitable format. And usually people will tailor their upgrade order in a way where it's upgraded from left to right. So you get your first couple of items here, and you would basically upgrade in this left to right order. So first I'd go close quarters, then headshot booster, etc. And that can be a great way to do it. If you're not super confident about the build order though, but you just know which items you want to get, it is also totally okay to make a category where you just buy things as you go, but you'll want to make sure to clarify whether it's a left to right build or just a buy as you go build in the description here. So we could say left to right, for example. So now it's time to think about the early game, and I'm going to say that we're going to build for a goo splatter slash goo ball based build, because I think it's a pretty straightforward build archetype for us to build for here. So in the early game here, we will want to incorporate some basic items to help get our weapon damage online so we can kill creeps faster, farm faster. We'll also want to build up some spirit damage because we are building for our goo splatter, and we will want to build up some health items as well so we don't die. We want a good mix of all three just to kick things off in the early game and fill out our slots. Now, when looking at your early game gun items, it's important to understand what type of character you're playing, because certain characters will benefit from certain items more, while other characters will hardly benefit from some items at all. So on Viscous, for example, High Velocity Mag is a pretty good upgrade for him because he has very slow projectiles that he shoots out of his weapon, and this item will help him secure his shots easier. So this is an item I like to add in my Viscous builds. However, if you were playing someone who has a shotgun, maybe, for example, we might want to go for close quarters, which causes us to deal additional weapon damage when in close range, and we want to be in close range with a shotgun anyways, but Viscous doesn't necessarily need that as much. Headshot Booster is a really good item for characters that have slower fire rates but deal big impact with their weapons, because this item has a passive internal cooldown of 8.5 seconds, so you're not going to be proccing it all the time. And so, I mean, it can work on any character, but I just find that it makes a little bit more sense on those characters. It just adds to the impact of the weapon. And Hollow Point Ward is a nice general item. Whenever you're healthy, you deal additional weapon damage, probably one of the most common early game items out there. Next up, we have the Vitality items, and these are also pretty important in the early game, because you do want to get some early game healing online, especially if you're having trouble in your lane. So oftentimes what people will do in their builds is they'll put healing right in, but clarify that it's basically an optional item. You basically go over here, update the annotation, and say only buy this if you need it. And that is because sometimes you just have a really good lane, you don't need the healing, and so you don't need this item. But oftentimes it is a very good item, and you'll usually see it in most builds just as kind of one of those extras. Extra regen, enduring spirit, and melee lifesteal are all also good early game sources of healing, and which one you get really depends on the type of build you're going for. If you're going for someone who isn't doing much spirit damage or much meleeing, then extra regen is the most sensible choice. If you're doing a lot of spirit damage, then enduring spirit makes sense because it gives spirit lifesteal and spirit power, and if you're going for a melee build, obviously melee lifesteal. So this is highly dependent on your build. For this one, we'll go for enduring spirit because we're trying to build around the goo splatter and the goo ball. And finally, the spirit items. Now, if you're playing a gun-based build, these won't be super useful for you, and you might want to go for something that helps a little bit more with your gun-based gameplay, like ammo scavenger or maybe extra charge for a specific ability that gives you some utility. But if you are playing a spirit build like we're going to be making here, then you'll want to go for items that help your spirit build out greatly. So for the goo splatter, this does a lot of burst damage, and it's important to clarify that because other characters will do damage over time and they won't be able to benefit from Mystic Burst. But in this case, this is a really good candidate for Mystic Burst, so we're going to add this to the build. This item basically makes it so that if they already do a big burst of damage, 80 damage or more, then it'll slap additional damage on top of that, making it even burstier. So this is a really good item, especially in the early game for doing big damage on the splatter. And we can also chuck in extra spirit, which provides spirit power. This will scale up our spirit damage. Spirit power in general is a really good thing if you're going for spirit builds, obviously, because it scales up the powerful effects that you're trying to get. We could also use Infuser. It did just get nerfed. I'm still not entirely sure how meta this item is anymore. I have to do more testing with it, but this has generally been a pretty good option in the early game to add a lot of oomph to your abilities right before you use them. So we could buy an Infuser in this build, pop it right before we throw out our Goo Splatter, and get a bunch of extra damage and lifesteal on that. And we could also go for Mystic Reach to make that splatter easier to hit, and just fill out our purple items. So now that we have our early game items in place, you can kind of order these however you want. I've just kind of shuffled them around a little bit here. This isn't actually a real build, it's just kind of a demonstration talking about key concepts. So yeah, hey, here we go. This is a somewhat okay build order, and we have healing right at the end here with the clarification that we only buy it if we need it. You could even clarify that here in the description as well. Only get healing right if you need it. And it's very important to annotate your builds. Please do annotate your builds where needed on certain active items or optional items or imbued items, especially like improved reach or a surge of power. Because even if you're not sharing your builds with anyone, you still want to have those annotations there for when you come back to the build later. Let's say you take a break from Deadlock or you take a break from the specific character and then you go back to your build to try and figure out what's going on. You might just forget what abilities you're supposed to imbue, so it's important to leave those behind just to give yourself notes in the future. But anyways, now let's talk about the mid-game. This is usually where I like to start really defining the build and also building up a foundation in order to farm more, get more souls, so that way we can get onto the late-game items later. But one thing to remember as you get into those later mid-game rounds is that flex slots suddenly become an important thing. You don't get all your flex slots right away. Usually you only have 1 or 2 in the mid-game, depending on how quickly you kill the guardians and walkers. And so you don't want to fill out your build with just a bunch of items here, because then you won't have the flex slots to fill these all out. So you gotta bear that in mind and try to only have, 1 or 2 flex slots required within this category. So I've already got 4 spirit items here, and I maybe could put in 1 more, but if I start to add in like a duration extender, bullet resist shredder, all that random crap, I'm not going to have enough flex slots for that. So instead what I might want to do is chuck in an improved burst, because this will upgrade an existing item. And if you want to know if something upgrades into something, then you can just read on the very bottom of the description where it says is component of. So if it lists a component, that means it upgrades into something, and if it doesn't list a component, like this hollow point ward here, then yeah, that means it doesn't upgrade into anything, and you would either sell it later or I guess just keep it around. So since we are playing a spirit-based Viscous build here, focused around burst damage with the splatter and the goo ball, and maintaining uptime on our abilities, then that means we don't necessarily need as many weapon items. However, it is still generally a good idea to fill out your weapon items, so we could go for some other options here. We could go for Mystic Shot, which is a pretty good gun item if you are playing a spirit-based character, because it adds spirit damage to your weapon, and this will scale with spirit power. So as you level up throughout the the game, get extra spirit, get improved spirit, get spirit power from those urns and sinner's sacrifices that you're breaking. This will do more and more damage. So I usually like to get this if I'm playing a spirit-based character, just to give that gun that extra little bit of power, and it's pretty cheap too, so it's a pretty good item. And another gun item that's absolutely fantastic on spirit builds is Soul Shredder bullets, because it gives you a spirit amp and spirit lifesteal on the enemies that you shoot. So you basically apply a debuff to them for 6 seconds, where in that time you're doing more spirit damage and you're lifestealing off that. So it's a way to basically make your gun items work towards your spirit power. It's a really, really good item for a build like this. Now, remembering what I said about flex slots, we want to try and make sure that we have enough space to actually fit all of the items, and so we want to focus on upgrading some of the items that we got in the early game and maybe add in just 1 or 2 other items. So we could add a Torment Pulse, because this does a lot of damage during our Goo Ball. It's a really nice damage upgrade, because even if you don't hit someone with a Goo Ball directly, you're still doing damage to them. And then we could also upgrade items like our Improved Burst, Improved Spirit, Improved Reach, that type of stuff. And for Vitality items, we can get items that complement our builds. So stuff like Spirit Lifesteal is really good, since we're doing a lot of spirit damage. We could get Healbane to cause our spirit damage to apply healing reduction, which is useful in most matches because, well, the enemies have a lot of healing, whether they buy it from items or they're playing someone like Lady Geist. Healbane is just really nice. We could also buy an Enchanter's Barrier to give us a Spirit Shield and also Spirit Power and cooldown reduction while shielded, which really complements the build. So there are a lot of green items that can help us out as well, and which green items you go for depends on what type of build you're making. So these are good spirit items, but if we're playing a bullet build, then obviously we'll want some bullet lifesteal and maybe a combat barrier. So just think about the archetype of your build, think about what you're building it around, what the focus of your build is, and then choose the items appropriately. So again, I'm just kind of shuffling around the items here. We're going to say again that this is a left to right category, and we also want to make sure to annotate our imbued ability here, Improved Reach, and say what we actually want to imbue that on. Now, if you're a baller like me, then you would want to imbue this on a Goo Ball, or if you are just really hyper fixated on splatter, then you could imbue that, but I think just for this build we'll say to imbue on Goo Ball, and I like to put in parentheses the bind for the ability, at least the default bind, just to really make it clear what ability you're talking about. I like being thorough. Now before we get to the late game, let's talk about situational items, because this is another thing that you have to factor in when you're thinking about your flex slots. So, there are certain items that you'll want to buy in some situations, but not others, like bullet armor versus spirit armor, or, of course, debuff remover, one of the best items in the game. Honestly, some people have just been working them into their standard upgrade order in the mid-game category, not even putting like debuff reducer in the situational category, because debuffs are just so prevalent in Deadlock right now. But I usually still put this in the situational category, and you can put other items in here too, depending on what you're trying to achieve with your build here. But those are usually like the super standard items. You could also throw a reactive barrier maybe in there as well, and you could also put some active items on here, like knockdown for flying characters, or maybe a silence glyph or ethereal shift. And these are usually universal between builds, but depending on a character's strengths and weaknesses, you might not necessarily need a knockdown, for example. So it does kind of just depend on what you're trying to go for. But yeah, if we take a look at the amount of items we have right now, we have 4 distinct purple items and 2 distinct green items in the early game category, and we do also have healing right, but we usually sell that later, so I don't consider this when I'm thinking about flex slots. And then in the mid game category, we add in 1 additional purple item, so this would take up a flex slot, and then we add in 2 green items here, and then this 3rd green item here, which would also take up a flex slot. So this mid-game category would have 2 flex slots required, and then if we were to add in a situational item like debuff remover, then we would need a 3rd flex slot, and if we also need armor on top of that, then we would need a 4th flex slot. So this mid-game category here might be a little flex slot heavy, to be honest, but it is also just a lot of really good items for us. So, and one thing we could do later in the game, especially after we were to buy Improved Spirit in this hypothetical build, is sell the Infuser. And I like to, as I'm developing the build, just mark certain things as sell later. So like Hollow Point Ward here, I will sell later because I plan on buying 1 more gun item that I'll talk about in a second. And we would also mark Infuser as sell later because it provides 13 spirit power for a short time. And once we get Enchantress Barrier, that pretty much is just a better amount of spirit power. And we would also have Spirit Lifesteal as a permanent source of healing. And we could also mark Enduring Spirit as sell later because, well, again, Spirit Lifesteal is just better than Enduring Spirit. And so this would also free up a flex slot. And yeah, getting rid of Infuser and Enduring Spirit in particular basically frees up 2 flex slots for this build, and so that definitely fixes things. Now finally, for the late game category, this is where you want to think about rounding off your build and adding in some big power spikes that are going to really set your build on fire and make it fantastic. So for this build, we don't really need gun items. However, since we are a baller, we'll want to get a warp stone in here. It's just really good. And honestly, we should probably put this in the mid-game category, probably a little earlier, maybe around here, or maybe here actually, I don't know. But yeah, Warp Stone is really good for this specific build because it allows you to teleport in Goo Ball and get more consistent hits on it. That's something you want to think about as well, is what type of active items would benefit your build. So if you're a gun-based build, Alchemical Fire will provide you a massive weapon damage boost. If you're playing McGinnis, then Heroic Aura is fantastic because it provides movement speed and fire rate to allies. And yeah, it really depends on what you're playing. Majestic Leap for characters like Lash and Pocket, good for engaging, using their abilities. So try and think about the character you're playing and whether you want maybe a little bit of extra mobility or a bit of extra survivability, or maybe an active item that gives you some crowd control or some damage. So what type of power spikes can we fit into our late game build here? Well, this is when we ideally would have 3 and then eventually 4 flex slots online. And so we have the maximum amount of slots available, and we can start to fill this out with even more spirit items because our focus is, of course, on the spirit. So stuff like superior cooldown and superior duration would be allowed to work into the build now, or Surge of Power. It really depends on what you really feel like using. Again, this is just a demonstration build, but yeah, you could imbue Surge of Power on your Splatter, for example, would be really good, or superior cooldown you could imbue on your Goo Ball. Superior duration, really good for the Goo Ball, not as much for the Goo Splatter, so maybe you would take duration out and just go for the superior cooldown plus Surge of Power route. Maybe imbue all 3 of these into the Splatter and just become a Splatter menace, or, you know, continue to go with the hybrid, which is probably what I would do. And this is also where you can get some big 6k items in. So for example, you could use Mystic Reverb on the Goo Ball to slow enemies after you hit them and deal even more damage, and that slow will allow you to hit follow-up hits with the Goo Ball easier. Or you could imbue that on Splatter if you really wanted to, Splatter and then Goo Ball on them. That could be good as well. You could go for Boundless Spirit, you could go for Diviner's Kevlar for the Goo Ball, but just think about items here, big power spikes that will help you to become a menace. By this point in the game, I'd say you probably have a good amount of survivability online, especially if you've been upgrading armors in the situational category. So I don't usually tend to put that many vitality items in here unless it's a key part of my build. For example, in a Mirage build, I might want Siphon Bullets, which will steal max HP from the enemies, which is just absolutely cruel. And one great item that I do usually incorporate into builds in a later game is Leech, because it provides a really powerful anti-healing buff, as well as a lot of Spirit Lifesteal and Bullet Lifesteal, which is also just really, really nice. But it does depend on the build, and sometimes you just might not have enough room for the Leech, but Healbane does upgrade into Leech, so you don't even need a flex slot for this if you have Healbane earlier on in the build order. Now, honestly, this build order isn't really good. I'm not really trying to make a viable build, I'm just doing an example, which is why we have Mystic Reverb and Diviner's Kevlar and Boundless Spirit all in the same late game. I probably wouldn't do that in a real build, but this should give you an idea of what you should be trying to aim for. Now, the last thing to consider here for your build is the ability point order, basically setting up when you unlock each of your abilities and then when you upgrade them. And of course, this will depend on the focus of your build. So going back to what I said earlier, if it's a Splatter and Goo Ball based build, you'll want to upgrade both of these first. If it's a cube based support build, you upgrade this first. If it's a punch build, you upgrade Puddle Punch and really focus on that. But sometimes there are still upgrades that are just worth getting early on, even if they're not the central focal point of your build. So let's edit the ability point order here, and for a Splatter-based build, we'll of course want to unlock the Splatter first, and then whether you unlock Cube or Puddle Punch second usually is determined by whether you prioritize early game survivability versus early game damage more. I think I'm going to keep things simple and just do a 1, 2, 3, 4 unlock order like that. And then after that, we can start allocating our ability points. So we will, of course, want to upgrade our Goo Splatter, get some cooldown reduction, but we still want to put an early point into our Puddle Punch here, because the first Tier 1 upgrade is +1 charges to the Puddle Punch. Double uptime on the Puddle Punch, basically. It's super good both for damage and for mobility, so this is something we'll want to upgrade, even though we're still focused on the Splatter. And then after that, we can go into the Splatter, and then by this time, we would have our Goo Ball online, so we could immediately upgrade this, and we could just upgrade that to level 5, for example, and then we could max out our Splatter, and then we could go for the other options, like maybe Cube and then Puddle Punch. But the main point is, hey, alright, let's make sure we're focusing on the key aspects of the build up first, and I mean, I guess we are neglecting our other abilities, but they can wait. We're trying to do big spirit damage, so we don't need the cube upgraded until much later. So yeah, that is basically my thought process when I'm going to make a build. Create a focus for my build. Alright, which ability and which sort of playstyle am I trying to prioritize? Then I get some early upgrades to basically set a foundation for the build. In the mid-game, I define the build more clearly and also set up some good items for farming, so that way I can get more souls to stay relevant and get those more expensive items online. And then in the late game, I go for some big power spikes. And of course, when it comes to the upgrade order of the abilities, very self-explanatory. I want to be prioritizing the upgrades that will help me the most with the playstyle that I'm trying to achieve. But of course, you don't want to neglect other upgrades if they are super helpful and you don't have to go out of the way that much for them. Like with Puddle Punch here, getting that +1 charges online in the early game is such a boon to Viscous' playstyle, so you don't really want to skip that. But I do want to show you a few other examples of different build archetypes, just to make sure that if you're building for like spirit damage over time, or a support playstyle, or a gun playstyle, you're not left in the dark. So let's go over some of those real quick. So this here is a gun-based build for Ivy, and this is a remix that I made that actually ended up being pretty popular. A lot of people really enjoyed it, so I figured I'd show it off here. This is what it would look like if you're building more for gun damage. So in the early game, we do still have pretty standard stuff here. We have early situational items. There's our healing right and our extra regen if we need it. And then in the mid-game, we are building that foundation of items so we can farm and also define the build more clearly. So we get items like active reload, bullet life, steel, quicksilver reload, Tesla bullets, and one thing you'll notice is that there are also, just like how there are gun items that help you with your spirit damage, there are spirit items that help you with your gun damage. So quicksilver reload is really good because it instantly reloads your weapon if you use an ability, and then we have stuff like bullet resist shredder, which causes us to reduce bullet resist on enemies when we deal spirit damage. It lasts for 8 seconds, and most characters usually have some kind of ability that can apply the bullet resist shredder when it's needed, so another really good spirit item for those gun type of builds. And yeah, most gun builds in the game are somewhat homogeneous in the sense that a lot of the guns in this game just fire really fast, and so stuff like Intensifying Magazine and Swift Striker and Burst Fire, these are all really nice items on most gun builds in the game. If you're building Ivy or Haze or Wraith or something like that for a gun, you'll see these items pop up quite frequently. And then in the late game here, we get Titanic Magazine, we get Lucky Shot, Crippling Headshot, some really big power spikes that help to make our gun insane. Lucky Shot is really good right now. Crippling Headshot is a fantastic item because it reduces enemies' resistances when you headshot them, so definitely recommend this if the enemies are getting a lot of armor. And yeah, you can generally see the type of archetype we're going for here with this sort of gun-based build. And then when it comes to the ability upgrades on a sort of gun-based playstyle, we basically just want to prioritize the utility of the character. So in this build, I actually prioritize the kudzu a bit more than the original because I use kudzu for farming, and that's why in the early game we have extra charge and extra spirit. But aside from that, you would want to, of course, upgrade stuff like your ultimate, which allows you to apply silence on enemies, so then you can silence them and then shoot them to death, or upgrade your stone form to get more utility out of that, right? Get that early cooldown reduction online. This is one of those upgrades that we go for early on, out of the way, just because 19 seconds of cooldown reduction is crazy. And Watcher's Covenant, really good on Ivy as well, because it gives you fire rates, although you don't necessarily need to upgrade it that much. The tier 1 upgrade is pretty good, but apart from that, it's really just supporting your allies, and who cares about that, right? I care about that. Let's take a look at a support build up next. So this is a support build that I've enjoyed recently, called Ark's Effed Up Slime Ambulance by Archetypes. He's a support Viscous player who's made some very fun YouTube videos. Recommend checking it out. But this is sort of what a supportive-based playstyle would look like for... We're going back to Viscous now, because Viscous is awesome. So, in the early game, we still have a reasonably sensible upgrade order here. You know, we have like Mystic Burst, Healing Right, High Velocity Mag, stuff like that. But for a supportive-based character, you're not necessarily focused on dealing that much damage. You're more so focused on helping your team, and in the case of Viscous here, helping them to stay alive, get them out of combat, and get them out of really scary abilities like a Lash Ult. And so that's why we go for an early rescue beam here. We immediately jump to a 3k item. Supportive builds can tend to be a little bit wonkier. They are a little bit more difficult and a little bit less conventional. And in the mid-game here, we immediately go for a 6k item. And it is okay to go for 6k items sometimes. It depends on the character you're playing. So for Viscous here, we go for Echo Shard early because the cube is a really powerful ability, and being able to use it twice is absolutely fantastic. And then for supportive capabilities, we also go for a superior cooldown, which we apply to the cube, so that way we get even more cooldown reduction on that. Enchanter's Barrier also gives cooldown reduction to the cube, and so we're really just focusing on ability uptime. That is the big key thing here. And then, of course, being able to stay alive while we're doing it. And, of course, staying alive while we're doing it, which is why you'll also see a lot of survivability baked into the build with armors, ethereal shift, and, yeah, also just the sheer amount of cubes translates into survivability as well. And later in the game, we can get a refresher, which allows us to triple cube. Yeah, what the heck is that? That's absolutely insane. Now let's take a look at a spirit damage over time build, as opposed to a spirit burst build like we went over earlier with Viscous. So Seven and Furnace are a couple characters that do spirit damage over time, and you scale that up a little bit differently. So instead of going for something like improved burst, which just simply won't work on a character that does damage over time, we will want to go for some other options that build up our consistent damage. So we still go for things like improved spirit, and in this case, this is also a farming build, so we've got stuff like improved cooldown, duration extender, just to improve our uptime of our power surge. And Surge of Power as well gives a lot of spirit power, which translates into more damage over time. But then we want to diverge and go into some other types of items, like Mystic Vulnerability. When the target takes spirit damage, they have their spirit resist reduced. So we can consistently apply this to the target and have a nice bit of extra damage as a result. This is a great way to have some extra damage on a damage over time build, but not necessarily on a burst build, because it doesn't reduce their spirit until after they've taken the damage. So if you just do one burst of damage and then it goes on cooldown, the Mystic Vulnerability hasn't really helped you out that much. So instead, it really benefits a build that does a lot of damage over time, like with Seven with his Power Surge, Ultimate, and Lightning Ball. And we can also go for Mystic Slow, which we can consistently apply with our damage over time to constantly slow down the enemies. And this is especially helpful during Seven's Ultimate, because you want them to stay inside of that storm cloud as long as possible. And Mystic Vulnerability will upgrade into Escalating Exposure, which is such a nice item for damage over time. Because basically, whenever you deal spirit damage, it applies a stacking spirit amp that increases your spirit damage to the target. And this can be applied every 7/10 of a second. And you can get up to 20 maximum stacks. So, if you just build this up, if I just buy this item, you can see that we are slowly going to be dealing more damage to the target. We go up to 16 damage per shot, and then up to, what was that, 18 damage? I gotta reload. 17, 18, 18, 18, 19, 20. So you see we're really just building that up. And we can also throw that on the ball. That's another good example there. We're just building up those escalating exposure stacks, and over time they're taking, suddenly, so much more damage from all of our spirit damage here. And while it may not seem like that big of an increase when we don't have any other spirit items or any upgrades or any of our abilities or anything like that, this can definitely provide a huge power spike once you do actually have all that stuff in place. So yeah, like, now take a look at the damage that we're dealing. 140, 150, 160, 170 per tick, 180 per tick. Ooh, that's quite big, and my spirit amp from my Soul Shredder bullets just ran out there, but now we're up to 200 damage per tick, so you see how that escalates the damage so quickly, and all of a sudden we're dealing so much more damage with our ultimate there. So that is a really good item for scaling damage over time in particular, but as you can guess, if you're dealing burst damage, you're just not going to be able to apply these stacks consistently at all, and so it doesn't make sense to get on someone like Viscous or Lash, but it does make sense to get on Seven. And finally, because I'm a big old nerd, let's talk about punch builds, because there are a select few characters in this game who actually do benefit from the punch items. Obviously, your first thought should be of Abrams. He gets up in your face, he punches you for like 700 damage, steals your life, he's annoying. But there are also characters who can build for the punch items because they have abilities that count as punch damage. Viscous' Puddle Punch, Calico's Leaping Slash, and Bebop's Uppercut are a few examples of such abilities. And so it's very important when you are building for these melee abilities to read what type of melee attack it is considered. So the very last sentence of the Puddle Punch description here says that this is considered a light melee attack. And what that means is that we want to be building for items that scale up our light melee damage, or basically just apply to any type of melee attack. So Melee Lifesteal applies to all melee. Spirit Strike specifically says that when you perform a light or heavy melee attack, so this will work on both. But Melee Charge here only impacts our heavy melee damage, so this would not necessarily be a good item for scaling the Puddle Punch. Why do I have it in the build anyways? Well, that's because the tier 3 upgrade changes the Puddle Punch to deal heavy melee damage, and so then, once we get that tier 3 upgrade online, we will be able to make use out of Melee Charge. Melee Charge is pretty much the only item in the store that you do have to worry about this distinction for, because Spirit Snatch and Life Strike, which are the upgrades of Melee Lifesteal and Spirit Strike, both of these will also apply to your light attacks. But, yeah, these are basically all the melee items in the game, like true dedicated melee items, and they are pretty powerful. Spirit Snatch will allow you to steal Spirit Resist from the enemy, steal Spirit Power, and deal bonus Spirit damage on the melee attack. Life Strike will allow you to heal for a lot, and it will also slow the enemies down drastically after getting hit. So these are really good on this Puddle Punch here, because it makes it do exorbitant damage, it steals their Spirit, allowing our Splatter follow-up to deal more damage, and Life Strike is good because it slows the enemies, allowing them to be hit by subsequent Puddle Punches, or Splatters, or maybe even a Goo Ball. And even if you're not fully dedicated towards the melee, it can still be worth it to buy some of these items in the early game. So Melee Lifesteal, like I mentioned, is really good for sustain in the early game, because it gives you that healing on your melee, and this will work against non-heroes, although it's not as effective. But on a character like Bebop here, with the Exploding Uppercut, where this does light melee damage, we can buy Melee Lifesteal and Spirit Strike in the early game and have this work on that Exploding Uppercut. And Spirit Strike in particular would be absolutely fantastic for that, because it lowers the enemy's Spirit Resist, and that will allow our bomb to do more damage with our hook, bomb, and then punch combo. So if I had Spirit Strike on that guy, he would take more damage when the bomb explodes. And obviously, if you are playing a punch build and you want to be up in those close quarters, you're also going to need the mobility and the survivability to actually stay alive, so that's why you often see melee-based users go for stuff like superior stamina, fortitude, making sure they're buying armor, stuff like that. But anyways, let me know what you think about today's video. Let me know if you thought it was helpful in the comment section down below. Did you become a better build crafter today, or was this guide totally useless? I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you guys have enjoyed, of course, make sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe for more Deadlock content from me, because I am making Deadlock content daily here on the channel, and I wouldn't want you to miss out on a thing. So yeah, make sure you're subscribed. And lastly, if you want to support the channel directly, keep me doing what I'm doing, I would really appreciate it if you would consider becoming a channel member, linked in the description down below. There are multiple price points, and you get a whole bunch of perks, not just on YouTube, but also on the Discord server linked in the description. You get access to some emotes, as well as some other fantastic perks, so I'd highly recommend it if you would check that out if you really want to help me out. With all that being said, thank you guys for watching, I will see you all next time, peace out.